The story that I am going to read today is called A Most Extraordinary Man. It will be appearing in an anthology by Luis Ortiz, which is called The Other Monkey's Paw, and it is sequels, homages, whatever you might call it, to old-timey horror stories like The Monkey's Paw. And I chose to focus on The Open Window, the Saki story, which maybe you were forced to read in high school. I don't know if anyone remembers that particular story. So I was attempting to channel Saki in this particular story. And the title of the story is A Most Extraordinary Man. Mrs. Sappleton hadn't thought of that odd Mr. Nattell since the day he'd fled gibbering from her parlor, due to, or so her niece Vera had said, a horror of dogs. But as she held a letter addressed from the man's sister in the States, the one who had taken such pleasant meals with her and Vera 4 years before, it all came flooding back. A most extraordinary man, she whispered while studying the envelope, a muttering which caused her niece to ask of whom she spoke. Nothing much escaped the girl's attention, Mrs. Sappleton long ago noticed, often in such a way as to be disturbing. Mr. Frampton Nattell, said Mrs. Sappleton. You remember the young man who— Oh, I remember him, Auntie, said Vera, smiling in a way which Mrs. Sappleton thought, if looked at from the right angle, could almost have been taken for a smirk. If you remember him so, then he managed to make a far greater impression on you than he did on me, said Mrs. Sappleton. Oh, we shared many things before you came downstairs to join us, many things. And from what you told me, they were not at all the things an impressionable girl your age should have heard. Mad dogs on the banks of the Ganges, sleeping in graves. The young man should have known better. But he was sick, Auntie. We should endeavor to forgive him. It's good of you to think so, to be able to find in yourself that mercy, said Mrs. Sappleton. And as she held the envelope up to the sunlight which streamed in through the large open French window, her curiosity changed the subject. It seems his sister has written me for the first time since that letter of introduction her brother had carried. I wonder why. What could it possibly be about? Oh, read it, Auntie, do, said Vera, clapping her hands. Mrs. Sappleton was pleased to see the girl, who had only just turned 16, show some enthusiasm again. She hadn't seemed quite herself in recent months, had not, in fact, been the girl Mrs. Sappleton helped raise since Mr. Nattell's brief eccentric visit, a passing strange coincidence. Mrs. Sappleton retrieved the letter opener from a low bureau in one corner of the room, slit the envelope lengthwise, cleared her throat, and began to read. My dear Mrs. Sappleton, she began, I wish I were writing you this morning under better circumstances. Something about the young woman's phrasing made Mrs. Sappleton pause. As she scanned ahead down the page, a sudden shock coursed through her and weakened her knees. She sat down suddenly, her hand went limp, and the letter fluttered to the rug. Sensing her mistress's distress, Bertie, her husband's little brown spaniel, patted over and licked with concern at the tips of her fingers. What's wrong? Asked Vera, in a tone suffused with equal parts excitement and worry, though it would have required extensive study to discern which was which. Mrs. Sappleton waved the hand, not being snuffled by the spaniel, in vague circles before her, as if searching there for words she could possibly say that would make the subject matter suitable for Vera's ears. Finding none, she dropped that hand in her lap and spoke in a whisper. I don't know that I can, she began weakly, then fell to silence. Then let me, Auntie. Before Mrs. Sappleton could object, Vera had scooped up the letter, and holding it tightly, stood bolt upright before her. Her eyes were bright, as if she were bursting with pride while preparing to recite a poem in school. She cleared her throat and began to read the unexpected correspondence with an impeccable pronunciation. I wish I were writing under better circumstances, she said, strangely channeling the intonations of Miss Nattell's speech, even though Vera had been but 11 when the two had last spoken. I have the unfortunate duty of informing you that my beloved brother, whose time on this earth was so tortured, and whose path through this world was so rocky, has died. I had hoped that the time he spent with you, which, as I have so often expressed, had been so refreshing for me, might prove equally so for him, might calm his fretful soul, but it was not to be so. He found no cure there. Frampton returned from his stay with you, as agitated as he departed, when he departed from my side. He was jittery as ever, starting at the slightest sound, his eyes always darting, his head constantly swiveling atop his shoulders, as if he was fearful of something none of the rest of us could see. Eventually, the exhaustion of dealing with his jangled nerves became too much for him, and I will be blunt with you, Mrs. Sappleton, he chose to depart this life. I do not blame you, because I remember you and your niece with kindness, and am sure that you each did your best, with your hospitality and your charm, to part the dark clouds which hovered unceasingly over him. Alas, his ailment proved too great to be lifted by any human power. I hope he is now abiding with the One whom in his grace and mercy may bring all peace to those who would but ask it of him. I hope that if fate allows, I may return to see you and your niece once more some day. Vera was a very interesting young girl, and I'm sure that by now she has blossomed into a very interesting young woman. You are both often in my thoughts. Please keep Frampton in yours. Yours most sincerely, Miss Edith Nattell. Vera stopped speaking, but her eyes did not lift from the page. Keeping her head down, her lips moved as she reread a section of the letter. Auntie, what did Miss Edith mean when she wrote he chose to depart this life? What exactly happened to Mr. Nattell? Mrs. Sappleton looked wearily at her niece, whose eyes glistened as if she knew more of the answer than her question would have you believe. I'm tired, Vera, she said, letting her head drop back against the Morris chair. Let us talk about this together later. Yes, Auntie, said Vera. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a pocket. Smiling, she left the drawing room and headed to her bedroom, where she read the letter over and over until it grew far too dark to continue reading, at which point she sat motionless in that darkness and recited it from memory. The following morning, Mr. Sappleton stepped from the lawn in through the parlor's large open French window and called out to his wife, Dearie, have you seen Bertie? I can't find him anywhere. He held his shotgun in the crook of one elbow, and his white mackintosh, as yet unmuddied by the day's hunt, was draped over the other. That's not like him, said Mrs. Sappleton. He's usually nipping at your heels by now, begging to be taken along. He's not the only one who hasn't been behaving like himself lately, Mr. Sappleton said grumpily. Hush, John, she'll hear you. And what if she does? A bit of frank talk would do the girl some good. She's been behaving strangely lately. You know that as well as I. Oh, I'm sure she'll grow out of it, John. All girls eventually do. All girls eventually do what, Auntie? Asked Vera, coming into the room. How about you? Said Mr. Sappleton roughly to his niece. Have you seen Bertie? Vera placed a forefinger to one pale cheek and tapped it there till her eyes lit up. Not since this morning, she said. I heard him scratching at the door to be let out. He spotted a bird he hoped would make him a good breakfast, and I let him have his way. Now, what was this about girls? Mr. Sappleton harumphed and stepped over to the open window, where he stared off toward the moor and the snipe which he hoped waited for him beyond. I'm heading off to hunt with those brothers of yours, he said to his wife, though it doesn't seem right somehow without Bertie. I'll see you later, dearie. He then dipped his chin toward his niece. You too, Vera. And then he was gone. Will you tell me about girls now, Auntie? Vera asked as soon as they were alone. In a moment, said Mrs. Sappleton, sighing, but before I do, would you please put this out at the postbox? She reached into the folds of her skirt and pulled out an envelope. I didn't sleep well last night, and so I wrote a letter of condolence to poor Miss Nattell. I can't imagine what it would be like to have one's brother. Mrs. Sappleton's voice trailed off, not wishing to expose her niece to such kinds of thoughts. Have one brother's what? Asked Vera. Never you mind right now, said Mrs. Sappleton firmly. Just put the letter out front, and then we'll have some tea and talk. Now that you're 16 and you're not a girl anymore, we can talk woman to woman. It's long past time for that. Yes, Auntie, said Vera, curtsying. She then turned and skipped away toward the front door like the innocent girl her aunt had first taken in. Mrs. Sappleton moved to the open window through which she hoped to see one final glimpse of her husband's back, but he had already vanished into the distance. She hoped he would be returning soon. It was early, but something already did not seem right about this day. Her reverie was interrupted by a high-pitched scream. Mrs. Sappleton hurried toward the sound and found her niece at the open front door, staring down at the welcome mat on which was curled the bleeding body of Bertie, quite dead. The letter opener, which had so recently been used, was plunged into his poor chest, and his eyes stared at them accusingly, as if there had been something they could have done but had chosen not to. Mrs. Sappleton grabbed Vera and pulled her to her bosom. Stop looking, Vera, she said sternly. Woman now or not, you shouldn't have to see this. But even as Mrs. Sappleton pressed her niece against her bosom, Vera twisted her head ever so slightly, so that she could peek at the remains of the little brown spaniel, its body twisted, its fur matted with blood. Her expression, unseen by her aunt, was one of both horror and glee. Mrs. Appleton sat by the open window, praying for her husband and 2 younger brothers to arrive home from the marshes soon. But she knew, even as she was engaged in the practice of supplication, that they, of course, had no idea that there was any need to hurry. As far as they believed, it was a day like any other, save for the fact that Bertie was off hunting on his own, just as they were. Another male, though a 4-legged one, doing a male's business, and therefore there was no need for alarm. For the trio of hunters, the day was no different except for the absence of a dog, while for Mrs. Appleton the day was no different, save for the horrid presence of one. "This is all the fault of a ghost," said Vera, startling her aunt. She had entered the room so quietly that Mrs. Appleton had thought herself alone with her reverie. "Whose ghost?" Mrs. Appleton asked reflexively, but realizing the nature of what they were speaking, she quickly changed direction. "There is no such thing as ghosts." "But oh, Auntie, there is," said Vera, wringing her hands before her. "And now that Mr. Nuttall is deceased, his ghost must be mad, just as he was. Vera, there's no need to be insulting, especially not with the dead. And his spirit has traveled here and has taken revenge on poor Bertie. Remember, he—" Vera hesitated a moment before continuing, as if struggling to keep straight the facts of a tale told long ago. He had a horror of dogs." "I remember no such thing," said Mrs. Appleton. "I only remember that you told me so." "Maybe now that Bertie has passed," said Vera, "poor Mr. Nuttall's soul can rest in peace." "And maybe you can stop telling such fanciful tales," Mrs. Appleton said sternly. "Whatever has come over you these recent months, I hardly know when you were telling the truth and when you were—" Here Mrs. Appleton stammered, because she had been raised properly by her own aunt and did not like to make such an accusation as she was about to utter, "and when you are not." "Oh, Auntie, I've tried to tell you the truth. It's just that I can't help myself sometimes. I'm a believer in romance at short notice." "Well, I believe we've had enough of such storytelling and speculation. Let's stick to rational, concrete facts, shall we? No more fabulations." "If you insist," said Vera, her hand moving to the cloth of her blouse and feeling Mr. Nuttall's letter through the fabric there. "What's that you have, Vera?" "Nothing, Auntie," she said, turning away quickly. "Whatever you've hidden, you must give it to me at once. As I've told you, there will be no secrets in this home." Mrs. Appleton stood and approached Vera with one hand outstretched, but before she could compel her niece to produce what had been hidden, her brothers bounded to the window and into the room. "Hello, sister," said Edward, the older of the brothers. He surveyed the room with a smile which turned into a puzzled frown when he did not behold that which he sought. "Has Bertie returned?" asked Ronnie, her younger. "If not, your husband must be disconsolate without him. You should have seen how he was moping without him on our hunt. I can only imagine how lonely he must be now that if his spaniel has not yet turned up." "Imagine?" asked Mrs. Appleton anxiously. "Why must we imagine? Where is my husband?" "You mean he has not yet returned?" asked Edward. "He should have beaten us here by quite a large margin. He left us more than an hour ago." "Yes," said Ronnie, "hunting wasn't the same without Bertie," he said. "And so he abandoned us to return for a look. We expected to find them here, frolicking together. Where could they both be?" Before anyone could answer, Vera leapt up, pointing with a shaking hand toward the open window. "Lock it," she shouted. "This is all Mr. Nuttall's fault. He's coming for me, just as he came for Bertie." "Bertie?" said Ronnie. "What happened to Bertie?" "Who's Mr. Nuttall?" asked Edward. "And why would he be coming for you?" "I certainly won't be locking any doors," said Mrs. Appleton. "How else will your uncle be able to get in upon his return? Whatever has come over you—" "I don't care," said Vera, beginning to cry. "I don't care about any of that. Lock it, you must. I've done something, Auntie. I've done something horrible, and now a haunting has befallen us all." Her aunt and uncles tried to get her to tell what she had done, but they could pry nothing from her save tears. As she was inconsolable, Mrs. Appleton slipped her a jigger of rum and led her up to her bedroom. Edward called out from behind the 2 women as they fled the parlor. "I still don't understand," he said. "Who's Mr. Nuttall?" Somewhere a dog barked, and it woke Vera to the darkness of her room. She felt somewhat dizzy, whether it was from the alcohol or the excitement of recent events she could not say, and for a moment she wondered if all that she recalled having passed during the preceding day had been but a dream. Hearing that bark of Bertie surely meant it was so, because how could he bark if he was— But then the dog barked yet again, and she shrugged off all symptoms of sleep as easily as she tossed aside her covers. She sat up, heart beating wildly. It surely sounded like Bertie, but Bertie couldn't be alive. She remembered it all now, and there's no doubt as what had occurred. She had seen him dead, murdered. After what Mr. Nuttall had done to Bertie, was she now being haunted by Bertie's ghost as well? Was the spirit of the poor creature bringing this upon their heads as the consequence of all our fabrications? She tiptoed to the window, hoping that in the slowly increasing moonlight she could spot whatever beast it was that had made the sound. Perhaps, she told herself, even though she doubted it could be so, she had only mistaken an owl for a spaniel. But as she stared out her window and down across the lawn, no further barking came, and so she had no idea in which direction to look in hopes of locating it. Then she saw something, a white glow that grew more prominent as the moon rose in the sky. Her heart jumped in her chest. Was this Mr. Nattell's ghost come to punish her? She stared, willing herself not to blink, waiting for the shimmering blotch to move as surely it must, but it did not. Then she realized it was nothing more than her uncle's white mackintosh reflecting the moonlight. Had he left it hanging on a tree in the yard upon his return? But if so, why had none of them noticed it before? She slid open the window and sculled down the trellis, ignoring the occasional scratch of a thorn. She would retrieve the mackintosh and bring it back to Auntie and Uncle, who had to be home by now, home and asleep the next room over, and things would be again as they had been. But once she dropped to the ground and began walking toward the glow, she saw by the shifting of its outline that it wasn't just the coat, it was her uncle himself leaning motionless against the tree, head tilted back against the bark, studying the night sky as she approached. "Uncle, what are you doing out here?" asked Vera. "You have worried poor Auntie so much." He did not answer her. She drew nearer and touched his hand so he would look down and notice her. Could he have fallen asleep out here in the cool air? But no. Now that she was before him, she could see his hair was matted with blood, mirroring Bertie's fur. But no knife had made his wounds. He'd been struck by a rock. She tugged at his hands, and his head fell forward, his chin against his chest. His eyes, though wide, saw her not. She shrieked, pulling back her hand, and as she did so, her uncle hobbled forward, knocking her off her feet, pinning her beneath him to the lawn. She could not move, could barely breathe from the sheer weight of him, and soon lost consciousness beneath the stars. When Vera woke, Auntie was peering down at her, a stern expression on her face. "What are you doing out here in the cold and damp, Vera?" she asked. "This is no place for a young girl to sleep." "But Uncle—" "What about Uncle? He still has yet to return." Vera groggily propped herself up on her elbows. There was no white mackintosh. No Uncle. And she looked down the length of her nightshirt. As far as she could tell, there was no blood either. "I saw him," insisted Vera. "He was here. He'd been hurt, and he was—" "I thought we agreed there would be no more fanciful tales, and especially none so hurtful to me as that. But I'm not lying. Enough," barked Mrs. Sappleton, louder than Vera had ever remembered her. Mrs. Sappleton yanked her niece to her feet and pulled her roughly toward the house. "Let's get back to your room," she said. "But I don't want to go there," said Vera, as she was pulled in through the open window and up the stairs. She looked back at it in horror and grew hysterical. It had all begun with an open window, a window which her aunt had refused to lock. "I don't want to be alone," she howled. "Please, Auntie, don't leave me alone tonight. You mustn't, you can't." Mrs. Sappleton pushed Vera into the bed, but as she arranged the covers and looked down at her trembling niece, her heart softened. "Move over slightly, child," she said. "Allow me to get in bed beside you, and we'll sleep as we first did when you came to live with Uncle and me. All will be better in the morning. You'll see. Things are always better in the morning." Were they? Vera had no way of knowing, but as she snuggled closer against her auntie, she found comfort there, and fell quickly asleep. She did not dream, and if there was further barking in the night, she either did not hear it, or slept so deeply it did not wake her. When Vera woke to the bright sunshine streaming into her room through the window she had opened and climbed through the night before, she felt the clammy dampness about her, and her first thought was, not again. To wet yourself at her age, especially after being told you were a woman, was embarrassing enough, but to do it so while your auntie was sleeping beside you was positively unbearable. Vera disentangled herself from Auntie, and as she pulled away she realized the wetness was not her own. She tilted her head back toward Auntie's face ever so slowly, somehow knowing what she would find there, and saw her wrinkled cheeks covered in blood. The blanket which had been pulled to her neck was soaked as well. Vera leapt back, rolling off the bed and onto the oriental rug, unintentionally pulling the soiled blanket with her, which made her shrink even more, and she slapped at it, coiling herself in it more and more the harder she fought to free herself, until she finally broke away and could toss the sodden blanket aside. And there, now that she could see again, was Frampton Nattell, sitting on the sill of the open window, wearing her uncle's white mackintosh, the front of which was drenched with blood. "Hello, Vera," he said. It was only when he spoke that she noticed his hands were scarlet, too. You're alive, but I thought, you thought so many things, too many things, like your story about the tragedy that befell your dead uncle and the eccentricity of your pining aunt. My nervous condition had me on edge, Vera, and your fancies pushed me over that edge. But your sister's letter, she said. My sister said nothing. My sister, thanks to you, thanks to what you forced me to become, is no longer capable of anything. I wrote that letter, and then I returned to tell you that you are a bad little girl, and to make you pay, and to make all who loved you and all whom you loved pay. He made a move to rise, but Vera held a hand toward him, and he paused. Stay with you where you are. I have but to make a sound, and my uncles will be in here immediately. Then they will thrash you for what you have done. Mr. Natel smiled, but now there was a flicker there that remained from the nervous uncertainty of old. Your uncles are not with us, Vera. They returned to their own homes and spent the night with their own families. You and I are the only living things within earshot. They are too here, said Vera, setting her jaw. They could not bear to leave their sister alone without her husband, and so they remained in the guest room. You know nothing of a brother's love, Mr. Natel. All I need to do is scream, and believe me, I will. He knew there was no one else there. He knew it, but yet when the words fell from her lips, she told the lie with such flair that for a fleeting moment he believed her, just as he had believed her when she had told him that ridiculous story so many months ago. So when she inhaled as if to scream, he hesitated when he should have leapt upon her, and she instead leapt upon him, pushing him out the open window. As he tumbled back, she slammed the window shut, locking it quickly, regretting the falsity of her lie, and wishing that her uncles had been there to rescue her, but they, of course, were not. She could see Mr. Natel rise to his feet and hobble around the house, and suddenly remembered the open window downstairs through which Auntie had hoped her husband would return, but through which he would never step again. Auntie had left it open. She had insisted on leaving it open. Why had she not believed her? She raced downstairs and into the parlor and did not find Mr. Natel there. She was in time. The fall had made him lame and had given her the moment she needed. She leapt at the door and began slamming it on its hinges, but before she could seal herself inside, Mr. Natel blocked it with a bloody hand. She could hear the bones of his fingers crack as the door hit them, but his face showed no pain. His madness had transported him beyond its reach. He bruited the door open violently, the force of which knocked her back onto the rug. He stepped through the open window, looking so tall. Mr. Natel, she said, voice quivering, seeking in her mind for some tale that would divert him, and finding none. What is it you're planning to do to me? Am I to suffer the same fate as Bertie and Uncle and Auntie? Oh no, he said, letting the white mackintosh, now stained with red, fall from his shoulders and revealing that what lay beneath was equally as horrifying and bloody. I have something very special planned for you, Vera, because, you see, romance at short notice is also my specialty.